There's a picture of their original house at Plasnoeth in Anglesey. Now you can visit that. That belongs to Cadwr, the Welsh National Trust. It's a beautiful house. It's on the banks of the Menai Strait, overlooking Snowdonia. It was the home of the 7th Marquis until his death in 2013. The 8th Marquis now lives in London. But it is an absolutely beautiful house. It was very heavily remodelled by the 1st Marquis and by the 5th Marquis. But it's a lovely house. There's a lot of the stuff from Beaudesert was transferred to that house when they lost Beaudesert. But it is a lovely house. And very well worth a visit. It's just across the old Menai Straits Bridge, just across there. Now this is a photograph, a painting of young Lord Paget, typical of young men of his day. When he was 18, he was sent on the grand tour by his father with a particularly dour and very unappealing tutor who he complained was terribly boring. But his father picked him specifically because he was a very boring man and took him on the grand tour of all the capitals of Europe to improve his French and to give him a thorough gentleman's education. But as you can see, unfortunately, he visited a lady of high birth but low morals before he left London. He was assured that she was a lady of quite safe to visit, but apparently she wasn't. When he got a start of strands and then had to go and see his tutor and tell him that he was suffering from a burning sensation, and fortunately they were in Strasbourg at the time, which was a large French garrison who had many doctors skilled in the cure of what we would call venereal disease, and they had to stay there several months while he did a cure. And any gentleman who went through the sex education at school in the 60s will know exactly what that meant, like I did. Anybody who had sex education in the 60s will know exactly what that meant, the umbrella cure. Yes, he had to stay there several months while a cure was effective. That taught him a lesson, but it didn't teach him all the lessons he needed to learn. Apparently, they kept meeting up with young men he was at school with. He was at school with the eldest sons of the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Worcester, and their tours kept meeting up in various towns all over Europe. And he kept getting into all kinds of scrapes with these young men. And during one of their meetings, they met up in Geneva. And these 3 young men came up with the idea of capturing Geneva. So they got well and truly drunk and decided that they'd captured Geneva. So they went out one evening, 3 of them, and decided to take one of the gatehouses of Geneva. All cities in these days in Europe used to close the main gates in the evening time and lock them to stop ne'er-do-wells coming in and out of the cities at night. And they'd have a little ceremony and they'd lock the gates with the great keys. So they decided that they'd take the key one evening. So they overpowered the city gatekeepers, who were elderly gentlemen, and they overpowered the city gatekeepers one evening and declared they'd taken Geneva and they got the keys to Geneva, and they were quickly overpowered by the militia and thrown into jail. These 3 young English noblemen thrown into jail, much to the distress of their tutors. Luckily, the Duke of Gloucester, the English Royal Duke of Gloucester, was on holiday in Geneva at that time, and he heard of what went on. and managed to intercede with the authorities in Geneva, and was able to have these three young men dragged from their prison cells, and gave them a right royal dressing down in front of the city fathers, and made them feel about this tour, and no doubt in private gave them a wink and sent them on their way, but saved them from real disgrace and having to write to their fathers and tell them what they'd done. But that was the kind of hijinks they got up to on their grand tours. But while they were on the grand tour, they also visited Berlin. And while they were in Berlin, he had to write home to his father saying that everyone in Berlin was in uniform. He was visiting balls and levees and all kinds of things, and everyone in Berlin was in uniform, and he felt very much out of place. And he wrote home to his father and said, "Could you enroll me in the Staffordshire Militia?" His father was colonel in the Staffordshire Militia. "Could you enroll me in the Staffordshire Militia so I could have a red coat?" So his father enrolled him into the Staffordshire Militia, very pleased that he'd taken an interest in something military. And his father enrolled him in the Staffordshire Militia and got his tailor to run him up a red coat, sent him back to Berlin so he could appear at these levees in the military uniform. And that was his first appearance in military uniform. And then when he came home, we started our wars with the French Revolutionary government. So he wrote to William Pitt, Prime Minister, asking whether he could raise a regiment of cavalry. He's interested in raising a regiment of cavalry. And William Pitt said, "No, we don't want cavalry. Infantry is what we need. We need a regiment of infantry." So he was encouraged to raise a regiment of infantry, which he did. From his father's tenants on Camp Chase and on Burton-on-Trent, he raised a regiment of infantry, which became the Staffordshire Volunteers. Very famous regiment they became. They became the 80th Regiment of Foot. Eventually, they became part of the South Staffords, and the South Staffords eventually became the 3rd Battalion, the Mercian Regiment, and have now disappeared entirely. They no longer exist whatsoever, unfortunately. They were disbanded. But they were a very, very famous regiment indeed, the South Staffords, the 80th, the Staffordshire Volunteers, a very famous regiment. He was their first colonel, and when they were formed, they were sent to Jersey to form and to train, and he took them to Jersey, and he had relations in Jersey. His mother was a Jersey woman. His grandfather was Governor General of Jersey, and he had uncles on Jersey, and he was able to give some of his uncles, who were about the same age as he was, commissions in his regiment. He was their colonel, so he gave his uncles a lieutenant colonelcy and a majority in his regiment, which was a very, very generous thing to do, because his father had spent a lot of money purchasing the colonelcy for his son, and he gave away the lieutenant colonelcy, which is second in command, and the majority, major's rank, third in command. He gave them to his uncles, which was a very generous thing to do in those days, because that's how you recoup your money, selling commissions. And one of the other things he did, which no one, I've never read of any other person do in this period, was he and his uncle, his lieutenant colonel, lived for a week under campus, eating soldiers' rations and doing soldiers' duties to find out what it was like being an ordinary soldier. Now, for a nobleman, as a colonel, a lieutenant colonel, to do that in the 1790s was unheard of. It must have gone down terrifically well with their soldiers, because they all knew him. They were from his estates. They were from his father's estates. They all knew who he was. And he lived for a week under campus, eating soldiers' rations, doing soldiers' duties. They must have thought he was a tremendous man to do that. And when they were called to duty, their first action was to join the Duke of York's expedition to the Netherlands in the 1790s. They went on action with the Duke of York's expedition, fight the revolutionary government of France in the North Netherlands, with a Russian expedition, of course, and an Austrian expedition in the North Netherlands. And it was absolutely disastrous. more men died from disease than were killed from enemy action. Absolutely terrible. One of the other colonels leading the regiment there was a young man called Arthur Wellesley. He led the 33rd Regiment of Foot, who became Duke of Wellington. He was another colonel. And he said in later life, the only thing he learned from that campaign was how not to run a campaign. And it was so disastrous that any of you that will remember a nursery rhyme that was a very famous very famous satirical song of the day was the Grand Old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men. He led them up to the top of the hill. He led them down again. That was a satirical song composed at the time to mock the Duke of York's terrible generalship. He became commander-in-chief of the army, but he never served in the field again because he was so terrible. But that was Paget's first taste of action. His next taste of action was after he was gazetted as Colonel of the 7th Light Hussars. That's him as the Colonel of the 7th Dragoons, 7th Light Dragoons, the Hussars. That cost his father a lot of money. They were a very, very fashionable regiment. To be an officer in an infantry regiment, the equipment would have cost you about £200 to be an officer in an infantry regiment. It would cost you about £1,200 to be an officer in a cavalry regiment. So just to afford the equipment, it was very, very expensive indeed to be an officer in a cavalry regiment. But this was what he always wanted to be, an officer in a cavalry regiment. And he was colonel of the 7th Hussars for about 30 years. It was his life's work to be colonel of the 7th Hussars. And his next taste of action was in the 1808 campaign under Sir John Moore, when we sent an expeditionary force to Spain to reject the French from Spain with our then French allies, our then Spanish allies. And the English or the British expeditionary force got as far as Madrid when Napoleon decided that he'd had enough of his Spanish ulcer and took the Grand Army into Spain and chased us all the way back to the north of Spain, all the way back to Corunna. And Paget, as he then was, commanded the rear guard to keep the French from carrying us all the way back to Corunna, which is right in the north corner of Spain. He executed his command of the rear guard superbly. In fact, at a place called Beneventum, he ambushed the pursuing Imperial Guard cavalry superbly. The French were pursuing, the French Imperial Guard were pursuing our rear guard past the village of Beneventum, across a plain, and Paget executed a flanking charge and cut the French cavalry to pieces, capturing the commander of the Imperial Guard cavalry, General Lefebvre Desnouettes. Captured him, and he was sent under as a prisoner to Cheltenham. But like a lot of French generals, he was not a gentleman, and he broke his parole and escaped back to France. But unfortunately, during that retreat, probably due to the privations of the food, the conditions, and the stress, Paget fought or suffered from what we know, it was called tic douloureux, but now we know it as trigeminal neuralgia. It's an extremely painful affliction of the trigeminal nerves of the face, which causes extremely painful headaches, and he went blind, temporarily blind, and he had to be evacuated to the ships with a lot of the wounded, and he didn't take part in the final Battle of Corunna, where Sir John Moore was unfortunately killed. The British won the Battle of Corunna, totally beating the French, but Paget missed the battle. He was evacuated to the ship blind. But one of the more horrible things about our retreat to Corunna was we got all our troops away, but all the cavalry horses and all the artillery horses were shot on the beach. So the French didn't get them. Thousands of horses were shot on the beach. Horrible. But the next thing we hear about Paget is the great scandal. When he returned back to England and he got his sight back, he was nursed back to health in London, and he foolishly fell desperately in love with another woman. He'd married in 1795 Caroline Villiers, and they already had 8 children. She was at home in Baudelaire with 8 children. And he fell in love with Charlotte Cadogan. Or she was originally Charlotte Cadogan. She was actually Charlotte Wellesley, the wife of Henry Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington's younger brother. And he fell head over heels in love with her while he was being nursed back to health. He used his ADC, Colonel Bentinck, to hire closed carriages so they could meet in Hyde Park. And hotels, discreet hotels, where they could meet. And unfortunately, everyone found out. Hardly surprising, because he got made pregnant. He already had 2 children by her own husband, Henry Wolseley. And what was he to do? What were they both to do? They eloped. Charlotte's brother challenged Lord Paget to a duel on Wimbledon Common. They met on Wimbledon Common for a duel. Lord Cadogan shot at Paget, missed him. Paget fired his pistol into the ground, saying, "I've done your family enough harm, I'll not kill you." The pistols were going to be reloaded, and they heard the sound of the post coach arriving early in the morning, and they had to hightail it because they had all been imprisoned. Duels in these days were highly illegal. They'd have all been sent to prison, so they had to hightail it and leave. But they had to, Charlotte and Paget had to elope, because neither family forgave them. The Earl of Uxbridge and his wife, Paget's parents, wouldn't speak to him. Nobody in society would speak to either of them. In these days, divorces had to go through Parliament as an act of Parliament. Henry Wellesley cited Paget. Lady Paget cited Caroline Cadogan, and they had to go through Parliament to get divorces. It cost Paget £20,000 in costs. But it all went through. In 1810, Paget, when the divorces went through, Paget and Charlotte married in 1810. And Lady Paget, as then was, perhaps we shouldn't feel so sorry for her. Within 6 months, ex-Lady Paget had married one of Paget's best friends, the Bachelor Duke of Argyll, and she became the Duchess of Argyll. And all of her children called her Mamma Argyll. What happened to Charlotte Cadogan's 2 children? I don't know. I don't think she ever saw them again. But they went on to be happily married and had a further 10 children. So he had 18 children in total.
You don't get to take any of those.
So his next action was Waterloo, 1815, 18th of June, 18th, Sunday, 18th of June, 1815. Now, of course, Wellington didn't want him. He'd run off with his sister-in-law. But his best friend was the Duke of York and the Prince Regent. They were Paget's, or he'd inherited, by the way, in 1812, his father died, and he'd become the Earl of Uxbridge. So they were now the Earl and Countess of Uxbridge. His father had died in 1812. He'd inherited everything. So he's now the Earl of Uxbridge. He wasn't no longer Paget, he was Uxbridge. So his best friends were the Duke of York and who was Commander-in-Chief of the Army, who controlled all promotions and all appointments, and the Prince Regent. And they said to the Duke of Wellington, well, you're having... The Duke of Wellington wanted Lord Combermere, who served with him in Spain. But they insisted, no, you're having the Earl of Uxbridge. So the Earl of Uxbridge becomes the Duke of Wellington's second in command and commander of all the cavalry. And the Duke of Wellington apparently said, well, I'll make goddamn sure he doesn't run away with me. So there he is, commanding the cavalry at Waterloo during the final charge. This great painting, by the way, no hands in Plasnoid. It was in Baudelaire. It is almost life-size. It's about 18 feet wide, this painting. It is absolutely enormous. And it shows the 18th Hussars with the fur busbies and the 10th Hussars with the red shakos, being commanded by Paget or Uxbridge, as you know, is in the centre. In one of the final charges at Waterloo. It's absolutely enormous painting. It's not really very true to life, but it's an enormous painting. Huge, great thing.
Where is it now?
Plasnoid in Anglesey, in the great ballroom at Plasnoid in Anglesey. And it was at Waterloo. It was apparently he was absolutely excellent at Waterloo. Wellington said afterwards that wherever he needed the cavalry to be, that's where it was. He was excellent commander of the cavalry at Waterloo. And he was sitting on his horse at the end of, virtually at about 7:30 in the evening, next to Wellington. Wellington was sitting on his horse, Copenhagen, looking through his spyglass, watching the French run for their lives as the Prussians came in on the French right, and the British were advancing, driving the French before them, and the British cavalry were charging down upon them. And a final shot came from the French shell, and a piece of the shell curved over Copenhagen's neck and struck Paget was sitting here next to Wellington on his horse. A piece of shell struck Paget on the knee. And the apocryphal story, no one knows if this is actually true, but it's a great story. And it's in the film, very many of you have seen the film. Terence Alexander, the actor, Terence Alexander plays Paget, or plays Uxbridge. And he looks down and says, by God, so I've lost my leg. And Wellington takes his spyglass and says, by God, so you have. And he faints off his horse. No one knows if that's true, but it's a very famous story. And there is another apocryphal story. No one knows if this is true either, but there's a painting of Wellington visiting Uxbridge at around 10 p.m. following the amputation of his leg. It was taken off above the knee at about 10 o'clock that night in a little house in the village of Waterloo. Waterloo is about a good mile behind where the battle took place. The battle took place on a ridge of land called Mont Saint-Jean, which is about a mile away from the village of Waterloo. It's called the Battle of Waterloo because that's where Wellington's headquarters were, and that's where he wrote his dispatch to London about the battle. And it was dated and signed from Waterloo. So that's why the battle is called the Battle of Waterloo. It's about a mile away from where the battle was fought. But it was in a house owned by a man called Monsieur Paris. And he had his leg taken off on a dining table. And apparently he smoked a pipe all the way through it, through the amputation. And apparently the only reaction was he said he didn't think the knife was awfully sharp. The glove and the saw are the actual glove and saw worn by the surgeon. They are in the United Services Museum in London. The very table on which he had his leg cut off was in the house for many, many years. And on the anniversary, Uxbridge used to take his sons back and they used to have dinner on the table where he had his leg cut off. And there's one of his legs, the patented Uxbridge leg, which you could buy well into the 20th century. You could buy the patented Uxbridge leg, which was articulated at the ankle and the knee. And his trousers, the ones he was wearing at Waterloo, with still the Waterloo mud on, they're both of those are in a case at Plassenwyth. You can see them to this day. And that's the little gravestone that was originally on the grave. The grave was the Monsieur Paris, who owned the house, asked permission to bury the leg in his garden, and he built a little gravestone over it. And it was Le Tombe de Jambe de Marquis, the tomb of the leg of the Marquis, in his gardens. And people used to pay him to visit the tomb of the leg of the Marquis. And it fell into great disrepair. And a local businessman, an entrepreneur, a chap called Fred Pritchard from Hensford, paid to have it renovated. And it's now been completely renovated and moved into the museum at Waterloo. But there are some rumours that the bones were dug up years later and were offered for sale to the family for, I think it was £40,000. A French family offered them for sale to the family, and the family said, "Go to hell. We're not going to pay £40,000 for some bones. They could be mutton bones." But you could still see that what was the tomb of the leg of the Marquis, and that's why it was called. Ever afterwards, it was called One Leg, and the only English peer with 5 toes already in the grave.